Greetings, welcome to ITR Live. I'm your host, Chris Hagenow, and we are here for another action-packed, fun-filled episode of the ITR Live podcast. I've got John Hendrickson joining me here today, and we also have a very special guest today is Amity Shlaes. And John, I told you before we got started that you were going to have, well, I said this last time, you were going to have to carry us, and then I ended up going on about a 10-minute monologue. However, you're going to have to carry us today, John. Yeah. So I'm actually going to turn it over to you to get us started, and you can sort of introduce our listeners to our special guest today, and then we will sort of take it from there, and we're going to have probably a wide-ranging, freewheeling discussion of a whole bunch of fun stuff. So I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Chris, and it's an honor to have Amity on our show today, and thank you, Amity, for joining us. And I just want to briefly introduce her, and Amity chairs the board of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, a national foundation based at the birthplace of President Calvin Coolidge. And I believe it's the only privately funded foundation, if I'm not mistaken. But she's also a national expert on economic and tax history, and an expert on President Calvin Coolidge in the 1920s and the Great Depression. And Amity is the author of several books, and I want to just highlight a few of them, and they're all in our library here at ITR. The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, an excellent biography called Coolidge, and also a newer book on the Great Society, A New History, and then a recent volume that she edited that's a really good book and very timely, New Deal Rebels, an anthology of critics of the New Deal among other books. And then prior to her work as chair of the Coolidge Presidential Foundation, she served on the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, writing on foreign policy and taxation issues. And her writings have appeared in numerous publications, including the Financial Times, Bloomberg, and which has carried her column for many years. And now she currently writes for Forbes as well as National Review, and also a number of other publications. So, Amity, thank you for joining us. It's an honor for you to be here.
No, it's an honor to me to be with you and to be in Iowa. Right now, I'm more with National Review than Forbes. Just want to mention that. Coolidge was the last president not to have a government-funded foundation because a new law came in that affected Herbert Hoover on. So there are some private entities. I'm thinking of the Warren Harding set up. The Harding family generously supports that. Yeah.
I want to start off by, you had a great sort of mini article you contributed to Modern Age. It was a symposium, The Best Precedent for the Next President. And you highlighted that there was a series of contributors that but, what presidents should serve as role models. And you selected a pair, and actually you highlighted two of my favorites, Presidents Warren Harding and Presidents Calvin Coolidge. And could you just maybe start us off there? Why are they still relevant? I mean, because a lot of people would think, well, why are two presidents from the 1920s still relevant today?
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, that was an interesting poll by Modern Age because they were asking for people. And I actually sort of responded by saying, no, a document is more important than any man. And then there were two presidents who went along with that document. Of course, the 20s are relevant. 100 years ago, the federal government staggered under the burden of debt. So similar to now, that debt happened to be more associated with World War I. But what to do when you're staggering under debt? So interesting. So I can't think of a more, I think that's probably the most useful time to look at right now because of the debt. The document referenced in Modern Age was the 1920 Republican Party platform and the associated briefing book the party produced. Why? Why would a book be of any interest at all? Because parties are often at crossroads, the GOP is now, and the GOP then had to make a decision. Were they going to go populist, or shall we say, were they going to go progressive populist, or were they going to stick to their old culture and their old goals? which is generally speaking less government. The party then as now is not entirely consistent. They were for tariffs. But otherwise, the GOP at that time had been the smaller government party. And they had a recent large figure, TR, who is different, Theodore Roosevelt. Well, are they going to go back to the Stone Age? To before TR? Many people thought that would be unwise. And yet the party went back to the Stone Age. It's like going back to Reagan now. They said, we're going to be the way we were, which is for federalism, power to the states, restrained Washington government, lower taxes, and balanced budget. And also, we're not going to experiment. You may remember that the campaign slogan in 1920 when Warren Harding ran for president was normalcy. And I don't know about you, but when I went to secondary school, I thought that was a pretty tedious logo. Normalcy. They want us to be normal, like Cogs. They want us to go to Normal, Illinois, go to state school. What is normal? It does not sound good. But what they meant was they wanted this. The GOP saw a normal environment so that business could be free to grow, and that was quite reverberated because in 1920 as now the country had just come through a crisis. Actually, they had a health crisis, the influenza. Which in many ways was more tragic than our health crisis, hitting young people, especially young parents. And then they had the crisis of World War I and the debt and all the things, disruptions the government had undertaken in the context of the war. So they said, let's go back to before 1914. Let's go back before 1900, actually. Quite a counterintuitive move for the party, yet that platform won, and the people who were the candidates were Harding and Coolidge for VP. But the platform itself won. Normalcy won in 1920. Why was that important? One was it was unexpected to the progressives within the GOP, and they split off. Very dangerous for the party. Talk about splits now. And it was also important because it meant that the personnel mattered less. And I'll just say one more thing about that. Harding deserves a TV show or a podcast of his own. He did so many wonderful things. I hope you have the Harding Revisionist on soon. He saw through the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. That is, he set the stage for government budgeting through necessary changes in the very infrastructure of government. He created essentially what we would call the OMB through that law. So management of budget to advise the president so that the president might have overview. Before that, it had been quite hard for the president to see exactly how much he owed whom and whom he should give a favor to. That law did that. He commenced tax cuts, which following the platform and the party promises. And he hired, their personnel did matter, a very strong Treasury Secretary, a man who knew how to take advantage of opportunities in the yield curve, which is really what you want in a Treasury Secretary. Think of the day. You want someone who sees how to reduce the debt by looking at the yield curve. And that takes a bit of skill. It was Andrew Mellon. But Harding wiped out, alas. He made personal errors. He hired the wrong people who got involved in a scandal called Teapot Dome. The scandal threatened to besmirch not only him, but also the program. And as we know, he passed away tragically in 23. What was important about the platform? It was still there, even though the president died. And Coolidge could just pick it up to switch metaphors like a baton. Oh, we lost one leader, but the next leader can pick up the baton and continue the race. And that is what Coolidge did. And having a strong platform made the party resilient, robust to scandal, which is what you think about today. Usually when the candidate goes, the lawmaker goes, so does his program, right? So that's really important. So Coolidge was able to continue what Harding had started, conduct, lead, see through, negotiate further tax cuts. And in that period, the top marginal rate went from over 50% to a solid 25% rate. pretty lower than Reagan, but this was before Reagan, and also the treatment of capital, which is so important for investors. You want to have an economy that can grow. It wasn't quite clear after World War I how capital gains should be treated. Many thought they should be treated as ordinary income and taxed at very high rates. Under Harding and then solidified by Coolidge, cap gains rate was set so that the effective rate of what the taxpayer paid for long-term gains was 12.5, which business found quite livable. So what the Coolidge administration and the Harding administration did before it through normalcy was reduce uncertainty to business, and that had a powerful effect in growth. So that's why, a long answer, I made a document rather than a man that is centerpiece of that little questionnaire response to modern age.
Yeah. I find that all fascinating, and John's our historian, and I enjoy it, and I think we've both been fans of Coolidge and that governance through the 20s for precisely those reasons that you talked about. And one of the things that, and we talked about this a little bit before we kind of went live with our recording here today, is how wonderful would it be to truly go back to that idea, both at the federal and the state level across the country. And, drawing on, and John, maybe you can jump in or not, but drawing on that, how do we communicate those ideas again for folks today? How do we make budgets meaningful? How do we get a political figure to, right now, the win is in spending money and giving things to people, and that's the formula. How do we move past that or back to a point where they actually get political wins for limiting spending?
Well, there are a few answers to that. I think one area, if you want to start with an area we can all agree on, is there's an absence of political trust. If someone's going to do a dangerous surgery on a child, take out his appendix before antibiotics, the parents have to trust the child. If someone's going to cut the budget of a government, taking things away from people, the electorate has to trust the leader who's doing that, just as he would trust a doctor as maybe not the perfect option, but the best possible in a situation of concern. So Coolidge and Harding before him, but let's stick to Coolidge, really believed in trust. If you win people's trust, there's a lot you can do. And how did Coolidge define trust? And then we can talk about technically. He defined trust as doing what he said he would do. Coolidge, there was plenty of what we nowadays say dog whistling, which is sending two different messages to two different constituencies. When you're talking political talk, Coolidge never dog whistled. He said exactly what he was going to do, whichever the audience. Because now we're in a situation in our polity where we say, he didn't really mean that, or I hope he really didn't mean that. He was just saying that to get that vote.
Yeah.
And after the election, it will be different. Well, that's a very untrustworthy situation, and you can kind of enjoy it and talk about it, but it doesn't give the candidate or the elected party a lot of support because he's saying stuff he may or may not really mean, and everyone's talking about that. Well, Coolidge said he sort of was like a doctor who said, the appendix has to come out. It has to come out tomorrow. We have no antibiotics. Lucky we might have one pill or other so the child goes to sleep during the procedure, but he might have some serious discomfort afterwards. That is, he was quite honest. And actually, the electorate likes that, just the way you like, you think of when you purchase a car, some people like to go to the most charismatic used car dealer, but other people like to go to a website where at least they know how they're going to be had or how uncomfortable the purchase will be, and they can isolate the danger points in the car purchase too. So people actually like certainty and they like honesty a lot. They just don't expect they can get it currently, and that's a problem. And the second thing was Coolidge was fairly good at showing what the benefit would be if the government were pulled back. And the benefit was prosperity. And if you go back and look at Coolidge's speeches, he says, I'm not for economy because I want to, I can't remember the term he used, but he meant be like Scrooge, to teach people a lesson. I'm for economy, not just because I want to save money, but because I want to save people. People benefit when the federal debt is lower because the interest rate is lower. And then they can buy bigger house. That's all messed up right now through the Fed's easy money, frankly, but it won't be messed up forever. One day we will confront the interest rates our parents and grandparents did when we're buying a house or when we're trying to keep a farm. And that interest rate will be too high. That's what it was in America's past. In Coolidge's situation, he was operating as for competing in the world market. The U.S. had to be better than England, or England would be the currency of reserve. And it's a huge advantage to be the most powerful currency, one we currently enjoy, but one where we could be challenged. So even in 2 years, Chris, it could be that a country, a sovereign currency, or a cryptocurrency challenged the dollar. Our interest rates had to go up to 10%. And then who do you want? You want the person who will move quickly to restore our economy so that people can enjoy lower rates. So it seems like a fantasy now, but it's not that you shame people into being responsible. That never works, the Scrooge approach, but you show them that their grandchildren will be able to afford homes as we've been able to afford them. They know that because, you know that from, first of all, from the good experience of state budgets. States do have to compete. Yeah. It's just a moment now where the federal government doesn't have to, but it's only a moment.
Yeah.
And Coolidge understood that.
I love that answer. That's terrific. John, I'll let you.
I think yesterday, your question, Chris, reminded me of yesterday. I was having a conversation with a group of business leaders here, and one of them asked me directly, because we were talking about the national debt, which is now $36 trillion, and I saw that's about $270,000 per household on average, and this was a retired CEO of one of the bigger companies in Iowa, and he said, why won't anybody in any political party take this seriously anymore? And he was specifically upset about Republicans. He said, because they're supposed to be the fiscal conservative party, and so I talked a little bit about Coolidge and trying to go back to those principles. And I think one thing is our governor, and we were talking before we went on air, is that Governor Reynolds, I think, is an example. Now, Iowa has I don't want to say a little easier because we have we have to balance our budget. I mean, that's in our state law. So, I mean, we can't just spend money like the federal government. So, but it's still hard. I mean, it's still hard for any politician to say no. But I think the governor and our legislature has done a really good job of saying no. And I think, the last few elections have demonstrated that, Iowa voters have agreed with her and rewarded her by expanding her majority. And so I think that's just one example, too, of sort of that Coolidge philosophy kind of operating at least at the state level.
No, of course. I mean, Iowa competes with Illinois for people, for souls, for citizens. And you are competing. Illinois is heading one direction with its tax changes, and Iowa seems to be heading in the opposite direction, if I understand correctly. Illinois is seeking a constitutional change to be able to raise taxes and using millionaires to make its case with. But of course, in the end, not just millionaires are taxed when you open the door to heavy progressive taxation. I always hope that one day you'd have to work the constitutionality. States could produce their own currencies. The Constitution doesn't like that, right? Or states could produce, and you do already through bonds. States could produce competitors. State, all you need to start a currency is some sovereign institution, state, foreign government, probably a commodity link, and maybe a company. Those three, if you have those three, nowadays there are not many technological obstacles to creating something people want to buy over the dollar. I mean, cryptocurrency is in its, or alternate currencies are in their infancy. But one thing we do know about them is that their popularity is a direct metric of the lack of trust in the U.S. dollar. The less we trust the dollar, the more we're interested in new monies, the hokey and the real. And so states can lead more than they know in the awakening of America. They already do it through their fiscal setup. But I think there are other ways they can lead to show show Americans that the federal government is the irresponsible party in the room. There's a lot about America that's still responsible.
Could you talk a little bit more about Andrew Mellon? Because I think he's a key player in this as well, and a lot of our listeners may not be too familiar with him. I mean, just maybe kind of give us a summary of, you mentioned a little bit about he served as Treasury Secretary and of course was key in the revenue bills of the 1920s, but could you maybe just give us a few highlights of his importance?
Oh, absolutely. And at the Coolidge Foundation, we try to think about it. We have one colleague, Mitch Robson, who with a great scholar, William Beach, is working on the tax revenues that Mellon built, that Mellon imposed, and trying to look into exact sort of, use an overused term, get granular on how Mellon did that. And we had another Sam Williams, who did a website we have called Coolidge and the Budget. I think it's coolidgeandthebudget.com. If you want to go into the Coolidge budget. So the first thing was to hire Mellon. And Mellon was someone who understood the yield curve. He was a great titan, not just of an industry, railroads or steel. He was involved in all the industries. He was one of the titans of the period, but he understood very well finance. So he could look and refinance, extend maturities, change the whole situation to lighten the U.S. burden technically. And some of this is technical work. How do you build a house? How do you build a fiscal house? It's rearranging debt. The other is he renegotiated all the debt of all the foreign governments that owed us money from World War I. And he did that very skillfully. And then he looked at the trade-offs with taxation. Mellon actually you're talking about how do you expose to people the realities. Mellon was an unusual Treasury Secretary because he wrote a book about taxation called Taxation, the People's Business. It's hard to get now unless you get a new sort of pirate copy or a new non-copyright copy, and that's fine too. Taxation, the People's Business. And that title was important because not a lot of people paid income tax in that period. So why is it their business? Because if taxation is lower, even if the tax isn't on you, the cost of capital is lower and goods for you, the humble consumer, are also cheaper and more available. And there he basically laid out what we would, long before we used our modern terminology, that lower rates can actually widen revenue, because there'll be more business activity when you have lower rates. And I know you've experienced that in Iowa. So it's sort of a Walmart principle, cut the price of something. How does the company make a profit if it cuts the price? Well, it sells more, so it makes up whatever it lost on the volume of sales. The government saw more transactions, had more revenue, the Walmart principle, and therefore didn't lose all its revenues when it cut tax rates, and did so repeatedly. So Mellon was so mighty, he was one of the great figures of the era, that it was said 3 presidents served under him. He was a bit of a threat to any executive, which is why it's to the credit of Harding, Coolidge, and then Herbert Hoover that they allowed him to be Treasury Secretary, because he was a greater name than at least Coolidge and maybe Harding too in the American ear. They knew the name of Mellon. He was famous. He was infamous, but mainly he was famous as a private sector success, and an innovator, a magnate. And he cut rates under the first 2 presidents, and rather dramatically. Then along came the Depression and Hoover, and that was tougher. but this primer, he made primers, and he explained with beautiful charts to the American public how he was doing, what he was doing at every point. He didn't just sit at Treasury and talk at the Council on Foreign Relations or testify. I love the CFR and I work there, but you have to talk to regular people too and talk their language and show what you are doing is not conspirational. He said, even though we're cutting rates and we're cutting rates on the rich, they may end up paying more of the taxes, and that in the distribution tables of the 20s, that's where we capture who's paying the tax, proved true. The rich paid a greater share of the taxes after the government cut rates. Why? Because the rich were less interested in hiding money or putting it in tax-preferred vehicles such as municipal bonds. They were just fine paying income taxes and capital gains if those rates were bearable. So therefore, there was money for innovation. And the rich paid a greater share at the end of the 20s than they paid in the beginning of the 20s. There you go, a populist goal achieved through a sensible policy. He didn't say, let's get the rich. He's by raising their rates, Illinois currently, he said, let's get the rich by making business possible for them. And it actually is true. And this, if you want to have a student go study this, I recommend the Treasury statistics of income, which are around. You can go online and find them from the 20s, and you'll see the beautiful charts. The distribution tables are stunning. The rich paid more, the lower the rate.
One other question I have, and of course, and this really applies to the state level too, is we see oftentimes from a lot of historians that, it was FDR that saved capitalism with the New Deal, and it was the New Deal model that really saved the American economy.